All right, my talk this morning is about spiritual bypassing. You may recall that Linda and Nelly talked about it a couple of weeks ago, and I've needed a little time myself to figure out what my take on it is. So here we go. I'm going to read the definition of spiritual bypassing, which is coined by John Wellwood, who was a clinical psychologist, a psychotherapist, and a longtime meditator. So here's what he says, his definition. A common tendency among Western spiritual seekers to use spiritual ideals and practices to avoid dealing with their emotional unfinished business, their psychological wounds, or their unfinished developmental tasks. So for me, dealing with is not very precise, and so I prefer to think of it as confronting and working with these issues that keep arising with us. So before I go on, let me just briefly start with the basic question about spiritual ideals and practices. In other words, what is meditation and what does it look like? Many people come to practice hoping that through meditation, their mind will quiet down, their body will relax, and they will feel connected to everything, that they'll be enlightened, in other words. Though no one talks very specifically about it because of its so-called supermundane nature. Enlightenment is imagined to be a perpetual state of ease, happiness, and bliss, the absence of dukkha. Who wouldn't want that? That such a perpetual state exists is one of those myths that persist because we want it to be true, and once we start meditating, we strive hard towards that goal. Although most meditation teachers say that there is no right or wrong way to meditate, there is often an underlying assumption that our meditative efforts will somehow lead to achieve such calm and blissful states. As I was exploring spiritual bypassing, it began to feel a lot like the second era, which I sort of briefly talked about last week. That is, the extra suffering that we sometimes experience, which we add on top of the initial physical or emotional pain or injury of the first era. And I think it's unkind to expect of ourselves that we can somehow skip the emotional pain caused by such an initial wounding. If we could do this, wouldn't we? Is there really a distinction between the first and the second arrow? Don't they really come together? Perhaps in retrospect, we can see the difference between the initial pain and the added emotional suffering, but at the time, usually we can't. The similarity between the second arrow and spiritual bypassing, it seemed to me, was a suggestion, either overt or implied, that we are responsible somehow for this suffering. We somehow bring it on ourselves and take it on. This logic goes, if only we recognize the second arrow, we could avoid the second level of suffering. And likewise, if only we could see our spiritual bypassing clearly, if we could experience how we use these spiritual ideals and practices to avoid our emotional work, we could avoid the disconnection and alienation from ourselves. But like the second arrow, isn't the main problem with spiritual bypassing that we don't know we are doing it? Commonly, the act of spiritual bypassing is often understood and talked about as getting attached to blissful states and then letting them take our meditation, thereby avoiding unpleasant mental and emotional states. In the early days of long retreats, teachers often caution about this. Don't get too attached to those pleasurable states, they say. Not only will these states inevitably change, but if you do get caught up in them, you can end up believing that the whole point of meditation is to achieve and maintain such states. And I guess, by extension, some people train themselves to remain in this zone, ignoring and somehow getting above the more mundane meditative states of list-making, planning, repetitive thought, and perhaps they even partially eliminate the hindrances. This is part of what is called spiritual bypassing. It has been my observation through years of looking at my own practice and through observing and interacting with others through teaching that some people are temperamentally more prone to blissful states. They seem to fall into calm states naturally, quote unquote, and that experience reinforces in them the idea that blissful states are what meditation is all about. This seems to have been true of the majority of my teachers in my early years of practice. This is a presumption on my part. They never would have said such a thing, but it's based on the fact that I never heard any of them talk about prolonged, difficult, and painful meditation, such as I experienced. People like myself who are not naturally predisposed to achieving calm and blissful states, therefore, find ourselves confused and anxious. Our meditation experience is different from what is being discussed in Dharma talks or in instructions about how to meditate. It feels like our entire meditation experience consists of one or other of the hindrances: ill will, restlessness, sloth, doubt, and sense desire. It's not hard to come to the conclusion that we must be doing it wrong, or worse yet, that there's something wrong with us. We fear that we'll never get it, and we become discouraged, disillusioned, and maybe even stop. So for me to feel comfortable in talking to you about something dharmic, it's important for me to have an experience of it so that I can talk from what I know and not just about the idea or the concept of it. These past 2 weeks, I've been trying to find examples of spiritual bypassing in my own experience, not just from Wellwood's definition. But as I said, since I'm not prone to blissful states, it was hard for me to connect my meditation experience with what is generally described as spiritual bypassing. However, it made sense to me that likely I was not immune to this phenomenon. I am not that special, so it stands to reason that I must be experiencing something like it. Slowly, I came to see that even though I thought I was dealing with my emotional unfinished business during those long hours of practice, I wasn't confronting or working with it. I was more stuck, captured, and enmeshed in it. But I still couldn't get a handle on how this stuckness might be part of spiritual bypassing. I thought about my practice life and how many years I actively suffered in meditation, how for 24 years of practice it was arduous and striving, dry and mostly joyous. Thinking back, I would recall it hard practice. Yet I kept coming back. I kept signing up for retreats. I led retreats. I trusted the Dharma. I just had an awfully hard time meditating. Like experiencing prolonged insomnia, I didn't stop trying to meditate. I just kept at it. Long, difficult hours, restless and awake, full of doubt and ill will towards myself. Slowly thinking about this, I came to see that there probably was no difference between blissful states and difficult ones. Really? From the point of view of the experiencer, both are captivating, they both seem easy to fall into, they both seem real and essential. And then the light went on. What they also had in common was that they were static. My painful and difficult meditations were as much a trap for me as the blissful ones were for others. This was because neither state actually opened up to what was really happening internally. Both relied on an almost trance-like mental state which was static, repetitive, and didn't allow anything new to come in. In their own way, each was seductive and alluring, addictive. I was hooked on my dukkha, just as blissful meditators might be hooked on sukha. Now, I understand this is quite a big leap, and I may not have convinced you with a single argument, but somehow it made sense to me. And it was time to write the talk, so I had to go with it. It made sense to me that my experience wasn't that different from a blissed out meditator. The only difference was the quality of the experience. Therapy and self-help are wonderful tools. Such work is useful and can bring much relief from suffering. And so can our practice, as Linda and Nelly talked about a couple of weeks ago. Reflective meditation helps us uncover our wounds in a slow and gradual way, gives us a safe time and place to explore our inner world, and encourages us to experience our needs and how we can meet them in a way that is nourishing to ourselves and others. Even so, in the end, we cannot avoid dukkha. It is with us all the time. Avoiding one kind of dukkha brings us up right into the face of another kind. Up to a certain point, we can use spiritual ideals to shore up our personal defenses and unfinished emotional business, but they don't go away. Neither the idea of liberation nor the dukkha that comes with living our life. Kindness to ourselves, acceptance of how we are right now, seeing impermanence, experiencing how things change and move constantly, that is what practice offers. This is the slow and steady path. Thank you for your attention. May the goodness that arises from our practice and from this act of sharing be a benefit to all beings everywhere.